Nathan, the webinar has started.
Yeah, so hello, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute or two. I know Zoom takes a few minutes to let all the attendees in, so we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, I think we're safe to get started. I see the participant list is not growing anymore. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third workshop related to the potential amendments to the in-use off-road diesel fueled fleets regulation. In our last workshop, we had a comprehensive discussion on what we plan to include in these amendments. And for today's discussion, we have developed draft regulatory language with some key modifications based on stakeholder feedback. We also plan to provide an update on the cost analysis for these amendments and our off-road emission inventory. First, a couple housekeeping items. The presentation material and the draft regulatory language is available on the ARB webpage, and I will have someone on our team post a link to those materials in the question area right now. This webinar is being recorded, and the intent is to post the recording publicly. So just a reminder that any information you share may be accessible and released to the public. And lastly, there will be several question and answer periods during this presentation. There will be two ways to participate. Attendees can either raise their hands and staff will call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question verbally, or you can type in the question area of the webinar and staff will read out your comment or question. Next, let's do some Carb staff introductions. My name is Nathan Dean. I work in the heavy duty off-road strategies branch, and I'm the staff lead overseeing these potential amendments to the off-road diesel rule. I'm also joined by Henry Chung, Nimra Mazur, and Amrit Sandhu, who are fellow staff members who will be helping facilitate the meeting by unmuting attendees and reading questions. Next, we'll have my manager introduce herself.
I'm Johanna Levine, and I'm the manager of the off-road implementation section.
And then Tess, my branch chief.
Hi, I'm Tess Ucat. I'm the branch chief of heavy duty off-road strategies.
Okay, so we wanted to start the meeting off with just a quick recap of the public process to date. We had a kickoff workshop a year ago in May of 2021, after which we had 3 subsequent work groups on targeted topics related to the potential amendments. At the cost work group, we heard from stakeholders that providing a survey might provide better results. So we released that survey in October of last year. Then we held a second workshop in December where we took a comprehensive look at each provision we were considering. And that brings us to today, where we have a draft regulatory language to discuss with stakeholders. Later in the presentation, I will also go over the next steps that will follow this workshop. I also wanted to start off this workshop by briefly going over the major components of these amendments. First, we are proposing a tier phase out of the older diesel equipment, specifically the tier 0, 1, and 2 engines, phased in over the timeline shown in this table. Alongside this, we are also proposing extending the vehicle adding provision to include tier 3, tier 4 interim, and non-California certified engines. This means fleets would no longer be allowed to add this equipment to their fleet after these dates. One thing I will discuss in more detail later is based on stakeholder feedback, we are proposing adjusting this concept specifically for ultra small fleets. But for this slide, I wanted to present what the concept was back in December. And finally, we are proposing adding a renewable diesel requirement that would start in January 1 of 2024. And we're also proposing some additional requirements to prime contractors. and public works awarding bodies. As I mentioned, this was generally what we presented back in December. And since that time, we received a lot of feedback from stakeholders on places where we should make some adjustments. We heard that feedback and agreed that there were some targeted changes we could implement that would still achieve the goals of these amendments, which, as a reminder, is primarily to achieve additional near-term NOx and PM reductions, while providing additional flexibility where appropriate. Today, we want to go through these potential changes and see if there's any additional feedback to this or to any part of the draft regulatory language. To start off with a simpler change, we heard that the terminology of operational backstop was not very clear, so we have changed this to tier phase out to make sure it is understood exactly what this requirement is doing. I also want to make it clear that we are not proposing any changes to the implementation years or structure of this requirement, only the terminology. Next, we heard quite a lot of feedback related to the extension of the vehicle adding provision, especially related to Tier 4 interim equipment. Some of the larger fleets that own this equipment would like to have a resale market in California when transitioning to Tier 4 final equipment, especially rental companies. On the other side of things, very small fleets are concerned about the upfront cost of purchasing Tier 4 final equipment in order to comply with the tier phase-out requirements. To address both these concerns, we are proposing to allow ultra small fleets only, which are 500 horsepower or less, to continue to add Tier 4 interim equipment all the way through to January 1 of 2035. We believe this would allow the larger companies to sell their Tier 4 interim to the ultra small fleets, and then the ultra small fleets would have a cheaper compliance option when faced with our tier phase-out requirements. I also want to mention that we took a look at the emission impact of this change, and we would be achieving slightly fewer NOx and PM reductions, but staff believe this is an important change to make in order to help address the feedback we have received. Next, we received feedback on our definitions for prime contractor and public works awarding body, so we have tried to update these definitions to be clearer. For some of these changes, we wanted to include the actual draft regulatory language in the slides to show what has changed. So our current definition for prime contractor is any entity that holds the contract for a project and contracts directly with the awarding authority or the owner of the project to oversee all or part of the project. And public works awarding body is defined as any public agency or official thereof that awards or enters into a contract for public works for the erection, construction, alteration, repair, or improvement of any public structure, building, road, or other public lands or improvement of any kind. We also received quite a lot of feedback regarding the prime contractor requirements we presented back in December, mainly focused around the vehicle level review of every vehicle coming onto a job site. We heard that this would be difficult to implement and onerous to the prime contractor. After hearing this from several sources, we believe some adjustments could be made that address these concerns while still achieving the goals we set out for these requirements. First, we have removed the requirement that a prime contractor must review each vehicle before it is allowed on the job site, as well as the requirement that a prime contractor cannot allow a non-compliant vehicle to operate at the job site after it performed this review. Our current proposal now states that a prime contractor must receive a fleet's certificate of reported compliance before it can hire a fleet, and that it can only hire and allow work to be performed on their job site by compliant fleets, meaning they have a valid certificate of reported compliance. They would also need to get a new certificate of reported compliance June of each year for the duration of a project to ensure the fleet stays in compliance. The prime contractor would also have to keep these records of certificates for 3 years after project completion. We have also added language where if a prime contractor discovers that a fleet does not have a certificate of reported compliance, then they must report that information to Carb. Also, if a prime contractor observes a vehicle that is not compliant, then they must report that to Carb as well. That is the only piece of these requirements that is still at the vehicle level, and I would like to emphasize that a specific review or inspection of the vehicle is not required. This only takes effect if non-compliance is observed. One new piece that we heard during some of our one-on-one meetings is we could potentially add language that requires prime contractors to post signage at the job site, highlighting basic information about the off-road diesel regulation and CARB contact information when non-compliance is observed. One of the main goals of these prime contractor requirements is to increase compliance with the regulation and to create a more even playing field among the regulated fleets. So we believe making sure fleets know that they can report non-compliance to CARB and providing easy access to CARB contact information would help achieve this goal. We might need to adjust this language to ensure it is posted in a place where work is to be performed or where there is employee foot traffic. So any suggestions from stakeholders on this language would be helpful. Our proposal also includes some reporting by public works awarding bodies, which we intended to mirror the reporting done for the Department of Industrial Relations for public projects. And we heard that a couple things we added were not in line with that DIR reporting and would be onerous to implement. Specifically requiring that they report any changes to the project within 5 days of the change. After comparing this to the DIR reporting, we agreed to remove this piece of the requirement. We also received a lot of feedback related to the availability of renewable diesel. First, there were general concerns about whether renewable diesel will be available in the capacity needed to meet the off-road diesel demand in 2024. To this point, we have already discussed that we see several large renewable diesel production facilities coming online by the 2024 timeline, both in and out of California, and we believe that this will address many of these concerns. That being said, we also included specific language where if a fleet is unable to obtain renewable diesel, they would have a path to stay compliant with the regulation. And we subsequently received a lot of feedback on the specifics of that language. We heard that what we had back in December would be very difficult to implement, so we have tried to simplify this language to be a slightly broader exemption that is easier for fleets to implement and better captures the different situations experienced by individual fleets. Generally, the wording has been updated to say that if renewable diesel is unavailable through a fleet's normal refueling method, then they do not have to comply with the renewable diesel requirement at that time. This means if a fleet normally contracts out for fuel and they cannot get a renewable diesel contract, they do not need to comply at that time. Similarly, if a fleet goes to a gas pump to refuel and pumps near them do not have renewable diesel, they do not have to comply at that time. We still have a requirement that fleets will maintain records showing that it is unavailable, and it also still states that fleets must make reasonable attempts on a quarterly basis so that once renewable diesel is available, they will start utilizing it. Questions were also raised regarding the interaction between the renewable diesel requirements and rental fleets. So we have added a provision that clearly explains this interaction. Overall, this language says that a rental fleet will include in their contract that a rentee must comply with the renewable diesel requirement. And as long as this language is in their contract, then the rental company will not be held liable if a rentee did not comply with the renewable diesel requirement. There are also a couple provisions we are proposing that we did not discuss back in December. First, manufacturers are required to ensure that the emission control label on an engine is visible and readable, but sometimes in use, this label becomes unreadable. When a fleet observes this to be the case, where the emission control label is not visible or readable, they must request a replacement label to be sent to them from the manufacturer, and the fleet must affix this label in accordance with the emission control label requirements in CCR section 2424. Second, we also realized we did not clearly explain how two-engine vehicles would be addressed by the tier phase-out requirements, so we added language explaining that if either of the two engines are subject to the tier phase-out, then that vehicle is not allowed to operate in California. So those are the bigger changes we're considering based on the feedback we received after December. And here we wanted to pause for a question and answer period to focus on these changes, as well as any other thoughts or comments related to the draft regulatory language. Again, we developed draft regulatory language that has these changes, as well as everything we're considering under these potential amendments. And that document can be found on the ARB program page. There should also be a link in the question area of the Zoom webinar that my colleagues included at the beginning of the meeting. There are 2 ways to participate. First, attendees can raise their hands and staff will call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question verbally. One thing we ask is that if you raise your hand to speak, please leave your hand raised and let Carb staff be the ones to lower your hand. In Zoom, it can be hard for us to manage attendees properly if you lower your own hands. So please let Carb staff handle lowering of hands. The second way to participate is to type in the question area of the webinar and staff will read out your comment or question. So first, let's see what questions have been typed in the question box while I was speaking.
All right, we have a question from David Schmid. Please explain how renewable diesel results in fewer emissions.
So we went into a lot more detail in previous public meetings, but so renewable diesel studies have shown creates, I think, 30% fewer NOx emissions and 10% less PM emissions when it is used in equipment that does not have DPS and SCR technology. So generally that is equipment that is pre-tier 4. So when used in equipment that is tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, we see this 30% and 10% emission reductions. And I'm pretty sure I have the NOx and PM correct, but if I switch them, I apologize. But so that is when...
Switch them. Yeah, switch them.
Okay, so it's 30% PM and 10% NOx, correct, Johanna?
Yes.
Sorry, I switched them a lot. But so those emission reductions are achieved when used in the older equipment. So in our analysis of the reductions we'd be achieving, we applied those percentage reductions to the equipment that is of that tier level. And then we also have an exemption in the language where if your fleet is entirely tier 4 final, you do not have to use renewable diesel, because studies show that in tier 4 final equipment, like I said, with DPF and SCR, there is a minimal change in the emissions. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Nathan. We've got a question from Jolene Fuentes. Are you solely relying on contracted employers to flag non-compliance for Carb enforcement?
No, so, Carb has its own enforcement division and we do enforcement on our end. A big part of the goal of these requirements is to help increase the compliance and enforcement of the regulation. So it is not relying on the contracted entities to do all of our enforcement. It's a requirement to have the prime contractors ensure that they are hiring compliant fleets, which is, the goal is to have an even playing field among regulated fleets. So we just want to make sure that when someone is hired, that they are compliant with our regulation.
Thank you, Nathan. Got a question from Gary Ma. Does tier phase out apply to low use designated vehicles? For example, tier 0 low use designated vehicles must be removed from the fleet by 2024.
Good question. So again, we went into more detail in previous meetings, but so the low use exemption is still in play and it does apply to the tier phase out. So if you have a tier 0, 1, or 2, and it is in low use, you can continue to operate it indefinitely. The one exception to that is we have a provision stating that in 2036, I believe, tier 0 cannot be operated even in low use. So that is the only part where a low use tier 0 cannot be operated after 2036. But other than that, low use is an option and it can be continued to be used even with our tier phase out requirements.
Thank you, Nathan. We've got a question from John Gilliland. Who will enforce the ORD regulation, Carb or the air districts?
So, the base regulation exists now, and right now Carb enforcement, does the enforcement actions. So Carb enforcement.
Yeah, and we do have some MOUs with local air districts that do enforcement locally.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Lewis. What is necessary for a emission control label to be readable at all times? Or sorry, what is the necessity for the emission control label to be readable at all times?
So a lot of that is defined in CCR 2424. I'm not personally super familiar with how it's defined. I know it says it's visible and readable. So I think if you cannot see it and you cannot read it, that would be the definition for those two terms. But I would more defer to what is explicitly said in 2424. And a lot of that should be handled by the manufacturer in terms of like what those requirements are saying. So the fleet would just have to, if they cannot read it and cannot see it, they would ask the manufacturer to send them a replacement label.
Yeah, so we're not changing the requirements of that regulation. We're just saying that if you observe that you cannot read it or it's not visible, that you have to comply with that regulation.
Thank you. We have a question from Courtney DePorto. Will Carb provide standard specific language required for the job site signage?
That is a really good question. And I think we're kind of working through that. If stakeholders have a preference or like recommendations, definitely let us know. I think we were thinking we could have specific language spelled out that says the sign will say this, and then have like a few sentences and like the Carb contact information. So that's, I think, something we could do and we've been looking into. If that's how stakeholders would prefer it, so then you just like kind of copy our language or copy our sign and just use that, let us know. Or if you'd prefer it to not be that way and you have reasons why, let us know that as well. I think, as I said, I think internally we were going to go down the route of trying to spell it out very clearly what should be on the sign. And I think we'll take one more written question. I don't know if there's hands, but we'll go to hands after one more written question.
Sounds good, Nathan. All right, we have one right here from Matthew Shiners. What is the earliest date at which Tier 3 would no longer be allowed to add it to a fleet?
So right now we have on adoption as our Tier 3 vehicle adding ban. What that means in the real world is, so we will go to our board by the end of this year with this as an item, and then it goes through an Office of Administrative Law process in the subsequent months to become an official rule. So we expect that sometime in like mid to later 2023 is when this would get OAL, Office of Administrative Law, approved. So that is when that Tier 3 vehicle adding would start. So once it is approved through OAL, which is in the 2023 timeframe. And with that, I think we'll see if there are hands raised and start taking questions that way.
All right, so far there is one hand raised from Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Okay, I'm Michael Lewis. I'm with the Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition, and I guess I had a couple of questions, but let me start with the renewable fuel item, and maybe some other folks will have some questions about that as well. But you indicate that you believe there's going to be plenty of renewable fuel based on whatever research you've done and facilities that you think are going to be available, and you haven't commented at all on the price of that fuel and how that relates to the existing fuel. And you're putting all of this on the back of the fleet owner to find it, use it, be able to afford it, and still be competitive, I guess. And there's no responsibility here for Carb if you got this wrong. So I guess the question is, what is your standard for, or your measurement by which there's going to be sufficient renewable fuel for the millions of gallons of off-road diesel that gets consumed every year? And what does the price of that have to be in order to be considered reasonable given the price of regular diesel fuel for starters?
Okay, great question. So to start off with the price, we have done some extensive research into the price of renewable diesel, and we have several years of data showing that historically, the price of renewable diesel has been on par with traditional diesel for several years. So we do see that they're at cost parity now and have been for quite some time. So we expect that through the future, the cost of renewable diesel will be the same to fleets as traditional diesel. So we don't expect there to be a financial cost based on the research that we've done so far. In terms of finding it and having that on the fleet, that is a big reason why we have that language for when renewable diesel is unavailable, because we do expect that renewable diesel will be readily available throughout California, but there could be certain targeted spots, due to distribution issues or whatever, that it's not available. And that's why we have that language in there to allow for fleets, if they reasonably can't get it, then they're not in trouble, basically. So it's not trying to put it on the backs of the fleets, but it's trying to make sure that we expect renewable diesel to be throughout California available. And then if there are certain situations where that's not the case, we want a pathway to have fleets to stay compliant. So that's, our thinking with that sort of language. And then the last one you had mentioned about the capacity, and I don't know the specific numbers off the top of my head, but we've looked into the amount of diesel that is used by the off-road sector annually, and I think it was like 300,000 to 400,000 gallons per year, and that has been like historically the last several years the trend of how many gallons is used annually. And then we looked at what production facilities are coming online by 2024, and it was much greater than that. I don't want to throw a number out so I know we talked more about this in the work group targeted at renewable diesel, but I think it was like almost a billion. I don't want to throw out numbers actually, but I know it was much greater than what the capacity that is currently used by off-road construction or off-road, what's covered by the off-road diesel rule right now. So we expect that the supply will be there in 2024. And then again, we still have that language when it's unavailable as a pathway for fleets in the cases that they can't get it. So I don't know if that answered all your questions. If you have follow-up questions or comments.
Isn't the renewable diesel heavily subsidized now in order to keep it roughly in parity with regular diesel? And why? How much longer do you think that subsidy is going to stay in place? And then what is the differential once it goes away?
So I believe the main subsidy you're talking about is the low carbon fuel standard credits that are used to have renewable diesel the price that it is. And that is true that program is currently making renewable diesel at cost parity. And I don't want to speak too much for that program, but I do know that it's expected to continue, I think, at least through 2030, and there's no expected end to the LCFS program or the credits that renewable diesel is generating. Again, I'm not a part of that program, so I don't want to speak too much to it, but it is accurate to say that that LCFS is subsidizing renewable diesel, but I don't think we expect that to end anytime soon. I don't know if others want to jump in.
Yeah, I'll add something. So it's the LCFS, the renewable fuel, RFS and tax credits contribute to the cost. Right now, there's no end to the LCFS. So we expect that there will be at least, cost parity through 2030. And based on the fuel consumption today by the off-road market, there's already more renewable diesel available today, according to the LCFS dashboard. So it looks like there was about 1 billion gallons of renewable diesel available in 2021. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of there's enough renewable diesel out there. It's just, is it available throughout the state, and and can people get it? And so that's why we, as Nathan said, we did have that language in there that if in the event that you are unable to get it, the fleets have a regulatory pathway for that.
Okay, I'll let someone else ask a question and I can I've got some others to talk about as well.
All right. Bill McGovern, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
This is Bill McGovern with the Coalition for Clean Air. This regulation is badly needed. We have levels of smog and soot in California that are unhealthy, that are sickening and killing thousands of Californians every year. And off-road diesel is a significant contributor to that problem. So we definitely support the tier phase out, as well as the renewable diesel requirement. Renewable diesel has been available in California for many years now. So there are ample opportunities for users to buy it and to get experience with it. And the low carbon fuel standard, far from going away, is actually going to be ramped up. So, you know, that has been the primary driver for deployment of renewable diesel in California, and that's going to continue. It's a cleaner product, it has lower emissions compared to petroleum diesel, and its performance is at least as good. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. John Blue, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, this is John Blue. Today I'm calling on behalf of SCAPA. And I had a couple of questions. And one, I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe key off of, I think it was Mike Lewis asking about the price. And it brought a question to mind regarding there is an availability for fleets to get a pass if fuel is unavailable. But if I was an enterprising fuel supplier bringing in very expensive renewable into a remote area, is there some price differential where you might consider it to be unavailable? Does that question make sense?
Yes, I think I know what you're saying. So like if the price was a certain much greater than traditional diesel, then there would be like an out for that because
right. Yeah, just something to consider. But that was my primary question was about, I noticed in the scoping plan that there was a discussion of taking a look at this regulation after the scoping plan is adopted, and that they suggest they might reopen these regulations. Do you know if there's if that's a real plan, or if there would be like a timeline for that?
Is this the scoping plan that was released last week?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, so it would be adopted at the end of this year. Yeah. So, you know, so potentially we could be reopening these regulations in 2023. You know,
I don't anticipate that we'd be reopening this regulation in 2023.
I don't want to speak for the scoping plan, but it might be referencing what we're doing right now. Yeah. Like, I think this is the opening that it's potentially referencing. I don't work on the scoping plan, so I don't want to say that 100%, but I would assume that's because we're not expecting to open it again in 2023.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks. I just wanted to raise that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
John Lane, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, my name is John Lane. I'm with Tykert Materials, and I want to, if possible, just go back a few minutes here when we talked about the phase out. Just make sure I get it right, because there was a reference to 2020 or 2036 that tier zeros would be available till then. When I look at the language that says that permanently designated vehicles exempt from performance requirements, but they need to meet the requirements in section 2449-1C. And when I go there, we've got this, section 1 that says that tier zeros in a large fleet can't be used after 2024. But then when you go just a little bit lower in 4, you get to the point where you reference, where it says tier zeros can be used until 2036. So Can you just talk a little bit about the differences in those two tables, the tier or the sections, section 1 for tier phase out for large fleets and that reference about 2036? What am I getting confused there?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I want as a takeaway is the intent of what we're trying to do. It might need us to update the language because maybe it is confusing the way we have it structured. But the intent is that 2024 fleets, for large fleets, 2024 fleet cannot use tier 0 equipment, but if it is low use, it can use that equipment. And then in 2036 is even in low use, they cannot use the tier 0 equipment. So that 2036 date is only for low use tier 0, and everything else that's tier 0 will have to be phased in the 2024, the timeline for different fleet sizes. I think I know what you're talking about, the way that it like self-references itself. So I think we would just have to update the language to be exactly what I just said. So hopefully I can make it clear when we update the language that like the way it references itself. But the intent is what I said. So low use can be used tier 0 to 2036 for everybody. And then non-low use is in the phased in. Is it, okay? Did I say it clearly, hopefully?
That's what I understood until a minute ago when you said that. So I would just say, go back to the current draft on page 29 at the end in section 7 and eliminate that word and, where it says the and meet the 2449.1c, because that puts you right into that table, and then then you're disagreeing with yourself there.
Yeah.
So, all right, thanks.
Good catch. I think we'll do maybe like 1 or 2 more hands, then we'll go back to Q&A potentially.
Yeah, I don't think there's any more hands.
Oh, perfect.
As of right now.
Okay, so we'll go to Q&A, the written questions.
All right, we have a question from Allison Torres. Please clarify the statement that refueling methods shall not refer to a specific distributor. Our fuel contracts are typically with one fuel supplier, and that supplier delivers fuel to our on-site storage facilities. If our contracted fuel supplier does not have renewable diesel available, please clarify that this will satisfy the requirement that renewable diesel is not available during the normal fueling methods.
Okay, we can take that recommendation into account.
Thanks, Nathan. We have a question from Daniel Langmaid. What if a manufacturer refuses to reprint an emission label when requested?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was like taking a note and then
Yeah, sorry. What if a manufacturer refuses to reprint an emission label when requested?
Okay, so that is very specific in that CCR 2424 that they have to. So from my understanding, that is a requirement that they would do that. So if they like refused to do that, then I think you could like inform Carb that happened, and then the manufacturer, like we would go to the manufacturer, I assume. So that is a requirement that they would send replacement labels, and replacement labels like very is like defined in CCR 24 and all of the steps and stuff.
Yeah, so they could contact Carb. That would be a violation of the certification for that engine.
Thank you. We have a question from John Gilliland. Is this Carb signage required for all construction sites? Is there a de minimis level where the signage is not required?
So as of now, we have this definition for what a prime contractor is, and then this provision would apply to any prime contractor and then any job site that prime contractor has. So I think that's a good comment and something we could look into if stakeholders think that there is a certain like sized job site or job that this should not cover. Because right now the way we have it is that it would cover anything that is handled by a prime contractor. So if there are thoughts or recommendations on that, definitely let us know. That's a good comment.
Thank you, Nathan. We have a question from John Blue. Do you have a sense of the size of the market regarding ultra small fleets that can continue to purchase tier 4 interims? In other words, will there be a viable market for used tier 4 interims?
So we do have like some information about like how many ultra small fleets are, indoors right now. So we have some information, and there's quite a few. I don't know, Johanna, like how much we can or shouldn't share, or what information that is. But
I'm pulling up right now.
yeah, sorry.
There's a good population of small fleets out there.
I'm putting you on the spot, sorry.
Hold on. So of the about 13,000 fleets we have, about 7,500 of them meet this definition of ultra small. So there is a large population of ultra small fleets. It's not necessarily the largest. They don't contain the largest fleet number of equipment, but there's a significant number of ultra small fleets out there.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. We have another question here from Leslie Morocco. Will the 30-day window, which allows an engine owner to register an engine indoors, still exist?
Yes. Yeah, the 30-day, there's like a grace period, right, to like register indoors. That still exists and would continue to exist.
Yeah, we're not changing those provisions of the rule.
Thank you. We have a question from Amber Colosso. Does the review of the renewable diesel include the supply needed for off-road and hovercraft? The hovercraft regulation also required the use of renewable diesel.
And that's a good question too, because so I think that I shouldn't throw numbers again, but we did look at how much the commercial hovercraft amount was, and I think it was like several 100,000 gallons of. So we did take that into account during our analysis of looking at the other sources of demand for renewable diesel, and we believe that there will be enough to supply both.
Yeah, and the offered numbers, the 300 million gallons includes hovercraft.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Ranisier. Sorry if I butchered your last name there. Regarding the renewable diesel flexibility, it is said that a fleet must make reasonable attempts to obtain renewable diesel. What is considered to be a reasonable attempt?
So this is kind of something where we wanted the language to be flexible enough for us to, take things on a sort of case-by-case basis. I think reasonable is like we have the, your normal refueling methods. And if you try to get renewable diesel via those normal refueling methods every quarter it comes back as you can't get it, then that would be reasonable. If there are thoughts on wanting to define it more specifically, that was kind of our challenge. Is what we presented in December is we tried to take that approach of being very specific, and it was tough because each individual fleet has such a different experience and situation that they're dealing with. One of the examples is at the time we had like this 25-mile radius defined, and like 25-mile radius for a rural fleet is very different than an urban fleet. So we tried with this language to have it a little bit higher level to give us that flexibility to make, individual fleet adjustments, while we're implementing it. So that was our goal. And like, if there are thoughts on how to even better refine that language, let us know, but that's sort of why we have it the way we have it.
Thank you, Nathan. We have a question here from Jacob Moore. Will there be any requirements for suppliers of diesel in California to switch only to renewable diesel?
So our regulation does not cover manufacturers of fuel. So I can't really speak to what is or is not going to be happening on the manufacturer side of things. Like I said, what we do know is that there are these renewable diesel manufacturing facilities that are coming online. So we expect the demand, what I've already said earlier. But we don't have, like my group, this program, these amendments don't have requirements on the manufacturers of fuel.
Thank you. We have a question from John Morrison. Does this apply to NE areas? I'm not sure if you know what that reference is.
Maybe can you type in the Q&A?
Yeah, I'll ask for clarification in just a second. I'll move on to the next question for now from Michael Bukantz. What is the expected 2024 availability of renewable diesel compared to the demand based on the rules that will require its use, not just for off-road use?
So as far as we know, the only regs that are currently requiring renewable diesel use is this rule, as well as what was adopted by the board, the commercial hovercraft rule. So I'm not sure, I feel like we've already answered this question because there's demand now to cover both of those regulations. There is the innovative clean transit rule that I also believe requires renewable diesel, but I'm not entirely sure. It's not just requiring renewable diesel. So I don't know exactly how to respond on that question for that portion of it, but it's a pretty small demand in comparison to the off-road demand.
Thank you. Just to kind of go back to the earlier question, they said it was NOx exempt areas. Does this apply to NOx exempt areas?
Okay.
That was like attainment regions. Is that John?
Yeah, I think he's talking about the captive attainment areas. I'm sort of guessing. Would he be willing to be unmuted so we could get clarification?
Also, sorry, what was the original question too about these regions? Was it related to renewable diesel or to something else?
It wasn't specified.
Okay, because there is, so while maybe we're seeing if we can unmute him, there is in the renewable, there's also an exemption in the renewable diesel requirement. The attainment regions are also exempt from that renewable diesel requirement. And then in the base regulation, there's also like some special provisions for attainment regions. So if it is referencing attainment regions, there are some special cases like renewable diesel in the base reg. So maybe that's helpful.
We can allow John Morrison to talk if you wanted to expand.
First, did he raise his hand though? I don't want to put him on the spot. If you want to raise your hand and we'll unmute you, but also I don't want someone to unmute if they don't want to.
Okay. Would you like to just go on to the next question?
Yeah, let's go to the next question. And then if you raise your hand and want to, or if I address the question the way that I answered about attainment regions, and then maybe we're good, but let's go to the next written question first.
Okay, we've got a question here from Michael Lewis. What is the emission benefit of renewable fuel on tier 3 and tier 4 interim engines?
So, like I said, based on the studies, and my understanding is that when the equipment does not have DPS and SCR, that is when there is a benefit. And from my understanding, tier 3 and tier 4 interims do not have those control systems. So they see the same 30% PM and 10% NOx reductions. I think I got it right that time. So tier 3, tier 4 interim have those same reductions in emissions.
Thank you. We have a question from John Gilliland. Can you expand on how ORD and PERP engines on ORD are impacted by this proposed regulation?
So everything covered in PERP is separate from what we're talking about today. So there's the two different.
Hey, Nathan, let me grab this one.
Okay.
I think this has to do with the 2-engine vehicles where in some local air districts, the local air district requires that that auxiliary engine also be permitted and is subject to the portable engine ATCM. So the way, my understanding is the way the portable engine ATCM works is that if it's subject to the off-road regulation, it's subject to the off-road regulation. And so meets the requirements of the perp reg by being subject to the offered regulation and complying with this rule. So that is not going to be changing. That's how the perp regulation is written. If you know of other cases where there's, some other confusion, let us know and we will try to address that. I know it can be quite confusing with these engines that, sometimes are subject to different rules in different places. The 2-engine vehicles are pretty confusing for fleets and for us sometimes. So if you know of cases where your portable engine on your 2-engine vehicle, your aux engine on your 2-engine vehicle is not just subject to the off-road rule, let us know and we'll try to figure out how that works with this.
Thank you, Johanna. We have a question from Chet Henley. Has any consideration been taken by staff for increasing the low use yearly hourly cap from 200 hours in effort to help small, medium horsepower fleets maintain compliance and yet still utilize some specialty equipment?
So as of now, we have left the 200 hours as what is defined in the base regulation. But one thing that we are proposing, which is with the intent of helping with using that requirement, is to allow a 3-year rolling average. So we did add this mechanism where over 3 years, you have to use it less than 600 hours. So basically it averages out to 200 hours. So that is something we're proposing to add to the permanent low use to try and help with flexibility in terms of that. But as of now, we're not proposing increasing the 200 number.
Thank you, Nathan. We have a question from Mark Fender. Draft section 2449 subsection 7 exemption for permanently low use vehicles indicates vehicles must meet their tier phase out requirement of section 2449.1 subsection C, but it was mentioned that the low use exemption shall continue regardless of the tier phase out requirements. Please clarify.
I can take a look at the reg language and make sure that it is very clear that the permanent low use is exempt from the tier phase out requirements. It could be that like I put that in and it shouldn't be there. So again, I just want to make sure it's clear. The intent is that low use equipment can continue to operate even with the tier phase out that is being proposed. And I will make sure that if that is referenced in there incorrectly, that I'll fix that. So again, that's a good catch if it does say something that is not clear, and we'll make sure to clean that up. And I think we'll take maybe one more written question and then see if there's hands again. I don't know if there's hands.
Okay, sounds good. We have a question from Bob Shepard. For the rental provision, the addition of a term condition is doable. However, there is no way with thousands of rental vehicles to determine if a vehicle comes back without renewable fuel. There is no way to tell the difference even when mixed. Additional, it is unreasonable for a rental company to attempt to be in the middle of being the informant when even if you were able to tell regular diesel fuel was added. Rental asks that this requirement to turn to the customer provision be removed.
So that is a really good comment. And that's something that we kind of talked about internally just late last week, that we kind of caught that it would be very difficult for a rental fleet to tell if a vehicle came back with renewable diesel or not renewable diesel, because there wouldn't be a way for the rental company to check that, especially like you said, with thousands of equipment. But what the intent was and what we would like the language to say, and we will change this, is to say that if Carb is doing enforcement and they discover that there is not renewable diesel in a piece of equipment, then the rental company will disclose that information to Carb. So it would be like if Carb finds non-compliance, then you would disclose who the rentee was in that situation. So that was a really good comment, and we definitely see where that would be very difficult. So we would consider what I just said as sort of replacing that piece of that requirement. Hopefully that addresses and answers the question pretty well. And then, like I said, so let's see if there's any hands raised. We'll go to hands now.
Yeah, there's one hand raised from Daniel. So Daniel Langmaid, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hey, this is Daniel with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. I just had a clarifying question or additional question on the emission label. Is the requirement for any fleet, any piece of equipment that should have an emission label on it to have one under this new proposal? Or is it only ones where Carb is issued an EO? Or I just was curious what the specifics of that were.
Well, for all Carb, to have an executive order, Carb executive order, the engine has to be labeled and there has to be a visible label. That is the part of the engine standard regulation. So we are not changing that. That's already a requirement.
Yeah, I'm asking because you know, we work on a lot of grants, for example, at our air district, and oftentimes the labels are missing, you know, on engines that we see, you know, just because of heavy use or whatnot. So, you know, we see that on tier 1s, 2s, 3s, you know, all different kinds. So when this is implemented, will all engines need to have that? You know, they're often like worn off and stuff. So I'm just
They're
curious
required
because,
to have it. They're required to have it now. What we're
Right.
saying is that if a fleet observes that they cannot see their label, then they need to contact the manufacturer to put to get a replacement label. The manufacturers now are required to issue replacement labels if
Okay.
necessary.
yeah, I'm just wondering, I was wondering about this because it seems like there may be a large influx of requests to fleets for this. So that's there to manufacturers. So that's why I was wondering. So thank you.
All right. Bob Shepard, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Actually have two, one related to the emissions label. I think you probably need to check to see whether or not that emissions label has to be installed by the manufacturer or the authorized manufacturer's dealer. I believe you'll find that is the case instead of just handing it over. It is with the on-road and you have an advisory on that. So you might want to check into that. And my other question had to do with, actually is a statement, you should be considering credits for the introduction of an electric in place of the diesel. I think that would incentivize, you know, some conversion of some sort, as opposed to just a single credit, kind of like you did with the, you know, maybe for a period of time, but kind of like what you did with the diesel particulate filter double credits early on in the program.
Bob, can you give a little bit more detail as to like what you're
So
asking for there? Just
so if you ended up going in with say a 60 horsepower, 70 horsepower electric that replaces 70 horsepower diesel, or in that ballpark, or an electric that would replace that, you would then in the fleet average calculation would actually get double that. You would get, instead of, let's just call it 70 horsepower, instead of 70 horsepower, you get 140 horsepower at zero emissions, you know, for introduction during maybe the first couple of years of this, 3 years or 4 years or something. It's just a way to help inject a little bit more, possibly, you know, to help your fleet averages out, help Carb.
so we're not proposing to make any changes to the fleet average provisions of the base regulation, and you can now use zero emission to comply with that. So you would be proposing to have a change to that part of the rule, in addition to because we did propose some additional flexibility back in December for zero emission equipment, where if you in your circumstance, in your example where you added a 60 horsepower equivalent zero emission vehicle to your fleet, what the proposal was that we would allow you to operate your diesel piece of a similar diesel piece of equipment that was subject to the tier phase out for an additional 2 years. So we did include some provisions there to add some flexibility on that end to help with the phase out. But you'd also like to see something on the fleet average side of things?
Well, you know, with everything, you know, trying to head towards some carbon neutrality and things, I would think that you'd want to maybe make a provision that is temporary, whatever it may be, to try to get, you know, electric where it may be feasible to get it put into the fleets. That's all.
Okay.
Just a consideration. This was brought up in our discussion, stakeholder discussion. Jim Halloran brought it up.
Another thing I'll mention before we go off the topic too is we have another zero emission sort of concept that I'll be talking about in the second half. So I definitely encourage feedback once we get to that point. But, you know, so the first half I just want to focus on sort of the amendment that we have so far. But just stay tuned for that, I guess.
All right. Peter Okarowski, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Peter Okarowski, and I'm a consultant to trucking companies, but also to the railroads. And we have off-road fleets. So I have a couple of questions on the renewable diesel section. The first one is my understanding, and this is a little risky because I'm not a renewable diesel expert, but I sort of play one on TV every now and then, if you know what I mean. My understanding is renewable diesel meets the qualifications of ASTM diesel, and therefore it does not need to be labeled as anything different. Now, if that's the case, how are we going to know what we're getting if we're out in a public fueling? And if somebody has something that's different from that, please let me know, because I am always willing to be corrected.
So
But for example, I know you can buy renewable diesel at the pumps right now, and it can be labeled as just diesel.
I believe most of the renewable diesel pumps right now are labeled as renewable diesel.
Okay.
Yeah.
But are you aware, I mean, does it need to have a different label?
We would need to check in on that. But if you have documentation that you believed you were getting renewable diesel, and then we did, you know, if we did a chemical analysis of the fuel that you had and it wasn't, but you could show us, no, I purchased renewable diesel. I think in that case, like, you've done your due diligence to get renewable diesel.
And that leads, thank you very much. And by the way, thank you for all the changes that you've made trying to address a lot of the comments. They're really, it's moving in the right direction, so thanks.
And I did just get clarification that Department of Food and Ag does have labeling requirements
for renewable diesel.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. My second question is, there's language in the section on renewable diesel about the fleet needing to assert its inability to comply. Can you provide a little bit more explanation? Is this an affirmative action that we have to take, or do we just need to collect receipts and then if asked later, we have to explain things? But it looks to me from the language that there's an affirmative action we need to take every time we try to buy it, but we can't. And what's that look like?
So I think the idea was that when you submit your ROR, your annual report and your ROR, you would, as part of that process, you would make your affirmation that you were in compliance with the renewable diesel provisions of the rule. And so that would be either you have the we wouldn't necessarily be asking for the documentation, but you would have done what you needed to do to comply with that requirement. Either you are using renewable diesel, or if there was a lack of availability, you have the documentation to document that there was a lack of availability. So it would be part of that annual reporting process. We weren't thinking that you would have to do some kind of like monthly report to us. that it would be part of this, your normal process now of how you report to us.
And thank you. That's very helpful. I have one last renewable diesel question, which is if I have a large fuel supplier that supplies my diesel to a facility, and I indicate to that supplier, I need you to supply me with renewable diesel, but they don't. Can I assume that that's just not available from that supplier?
So I think the
I really
intent
don't
of
want to
the-
get into the question. We don't want to get into questioning the supplier every time a delivery comes in that doesn't match renewable diesel. If I've specified in the contract, we want you to deliver renewable diesel when available, please.
And I think that the intent of that language is, you would go to your distributor, say like, I want renewable diesel. And if they told you, I cannot give you renewable diesel, then you did your due diligence. You tried to get renewable diesel and you couldn't from your provider. So, and then you'd have that, communication as your document saying like, I tried to get it, they told me no, and like, you're good to go. So I don't think you'd have to do like research or like figure out what your distributor's issues are or anything like that. It's just that you try to get renewable diesel. And if you can as a fleet, then you document that and then you're good.
Yeah. And I think in that case, what you're describing is that you have a contract with your distributor that they deliver you renewable diesel. If they can't deliver renewable diesel for you, they would need to give you some kind of statement that on this delivery, we were unable to give you renewable diesel, and that would be the documentation you would have.
Ah, thank you. That's helpful. And my last comment is just to support an earlier comment, which is if my fuel supplier says, sure, I can get you renewable diesel, but it's twice the cost. I think ARB needs to figure out, or I want to recommend that you think about that as maybe not being available. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more hands?
As of now, there aren't any more hands.
Okay, we'll go back to the Q&A. Actually, we'll take like one or two more written questions, but I want to get to the second half of my presentation, and there'll be another Q&A portion. I just want to make sure there's time to get through that, and then if there's questions on that. So I think we'll take like two more written questions, then we'll move on and then do another Q&A session.
All right, we have a question from Matthew Shiner. My small fleet has been in compliance for several years using back credits. If we expand during 2022 such that we become a medium fleet, which annual ROR is the first that the medium fleet emissions will be applicable? Is there a 2-year grace period? If yes, do we apply for the grace period or is it automatic?
Johanna, I think you know more about.
Yeah, so in the current rule, there is a changing fleet size provision, and it essentially allows you to, you have a whole year to get into compliance with the next phase of the, if you're growing in size, you have a whole, it's like a year, and you have to be compliant on the reporting date 2 years from when you grew in size. And so there is a provision in the existing rule that has that requirement in there. So that's already in the existing regulation. We're not proposing any change to that. And you do not have to apply for the grace period. Indoors, it already does that calculation for you. And so you don't have to, contact us and say, hi, I would like to apply. It'll automatically, when you report the vehicles and your fleet size changes, that provision is applied in the programming.
Thanks, Johanna. We have a question from Joe Mayer. Are the proposed changes in addition to the current off-road diesel regulation? Will the DOORS website be updated to display the effects of the proposed changes? For example, this Tier 3 engine will need to be retired by a certain year. And lastly, if these proposed changes are in addition to the current regulation, will the DOORS website be updated to evaluate fleet averages and targets credits beyond January 1st, 2023?
So
Do you want me to take that?
yeah, sure.
Okay, so yes, these are in addition to the current off-road reg requirements. So if you are, I see you mentioned to 1/1/2023, like if you're a large and medium fleet and on 1/1/2023, January 1, 2023, all your existing credits expire under the current regulation. And if you don't meet the fleet average target for your fleet on January 1, 2023, you're in an automatic 10% turnover until you do. So that still remains in effect. We are in the process now of updating doors so that those under the current regulation that will be shown to you on your compliance snapshot page. So that is being worked on now. With the suggestion that we update doors to include something about the engines and their retire dates. That's certainly something we can look into. We have not, really gone into the details of what, we're still in the development phase of these proposed changes. So we have not made any determination as to what changes will be indoors or not indoors. But that's certainly a good suggestion.
Okay, maybe we can take one more and then we'll move to the second half.
All right, we have a question from Bridget McLevy. Will there be certain levels or grades of renewable diesel? What were the results on the effects and impacts of various grades on engine functionality and longevity? Will it invalidate existing manufacturer engine warranties?
So from our understanding, renewable diesel, I don't think there are different grades, but it meets the same standards as traditional diesel. So it has no impact on like the equipment that it's used on. So it shouldn't have, studies have shown that it does not have any sort of impact in that way. So from our understanding, it's a drop-in fuel. You will just use it and it doesn't have any performance issues.
Yeah, and it should not invalidate existing manufacturer engine warranties. If you are being told that it does, we'd like to hear that information. So if you could get back to us and let us know if that's something that you're being told right now.
Okay, so I think with that, I'll go through the second half of my Q&A. Amrit, maybe we can like save those 10 and then like when I go to the second Q&A, see if there's new questions first. Like on the new topics. But I want to move on to make sure we have time to get through everything and we'll go through as many questions as we can after. So to kick off the second portion of the presentation, I want to talk about a new concept we've been thinking about since December's workshop. As we are all hopefully aware, the Governor's Executive Order N7920 directs California's off-road sector to go zero emission by 2035 where feasible. And previously, we included a vehicle-to-vehicle flexibility option for fleets who want to adopt zero-emission technology to try it out. As of now, that concept is the same as what we had back in December. What we have been trying to develop since then, though, is another zero-emission flexibility pathway for fleets that want to make a large-scale transition to zero emission for their entire fleet. If a fleet would rather invest their capital into transitioning their vehicles or systems to zero emission, rather than invest in Tier 4 final on our tier phase out timeline, we want to include an alternate pathway for those fleets. Our current thinking for implementing a concept like this would involve requiring that if a fleet wanted to make the substantial shift to zero emission technology, they would need to submit a zero emission transition plan to Carb that would define exactly what actions they would take to transition to zero emission, what the milestones would be, and on what time frame they would hit these milestones. We would also need to clearly define what the metrics are for Carb to approve or not approve a plan like this. Then the intent is that if the plan is approved, then that fleet would no longer need to meet the tier phase out timeline we have set forth, but instead meet their zero emission transition plan. We would also include a backstop provision that ensures if a fleet did not complete the plan, they would need to meet the tier phase out requirements. All that being said, we are hoping to get a lot of stakeholder feedback today to build out this concept. And for that, we thought of some questions to ask stakeholders. First, what should the minimum requirements be to be considered a fleet-wide transition? things such as a certain percentage of their fleet becoming zero emission, or other metrics such as a certain amount of infrastructure installed. What components should be required in the plan the fleet submits? We are already thinking things such as what vehicles are getting turned over to zero emission, detailed milestones and timelines, which zero emission manufacturers are involved, infrastructure assessments or plans to address infrastructure. Another question we had is what metrics should Carb use to review these types of plans? And lastly, what would be a reasonable timeline for projects such as these, and what would the milestones look like? So switching gears now, here we wanted to show updated numbers on our potential emission reductions from these amendments. Since December, we've done some tweaking to the proposal and have been working closely with the off-road emission inventory staff to update these numbers. I won't go into too much detail, but the general trend of reductions are similar to what was in December. Next, we wanted to also update stakeholders on the cost analysis we've been performing, specifically work we've been doing for the standardized regulatory impact assessment, also known as a SRIA, which will be publicly available in the future. At our December workshop, we were reminded that industry submitted new Tier 4 final cost numbers to Carb several years ago. So we went back and found that submittal, converted the numbers into 2020 dollars, and have included those numbers in our analysis. We also used the compliance pathway results that we shared in December to inform our analysis. We added in ongoing costs to using Tier 4 finals, such as DPF cleanings and diesel exhaust fluid. And we also added in the administrative costs to prime contractors and public works awarding bodies. And before we get into the results, we also wanted to share what the Tier 4 final equipment capital costs ended up looking like. The values in the second column show the estimated cost of new Tier 4 final, which is based on data gathered from grants funded by the Carl Moyer program between the years of 2015 to 2021, the cost data provided by industry, as mentioned in the previous slide, and the cost survey results we received from individual stakeholders back in October 2021. The third column shows used 5-year-old Tier 4 final costs, which is based on several years of auction data Carb has been collecting on used off-road vehicle sales, which we have shared in previous meetings. I also want to highlight that these are all in 2020 dollars. So taking these equipment costs and updates into consideration, this slide shows the preliminary results of our cost analysis for the SRIA. Over the full implementation period of these amendments from 2023 to 2038, there would potentially be an estimated statewide cumulative cost of $1.9 billion. This results in a cost effectiveness of $22,400 per weighted ton of emissions. The table on the right shows total direct incremental costs of the proposed amendments from 2023 through 2038. These direct incremental costs include vehicle capital costs that have been amortized over 5 years at 5% interest, Tier 4 final maintenance costs, as mentioned in previous slides, and the administrative costs for prime contractors and public works awarding bodies to comply with their new requirements. As you can see, costs are higher in the earlier years and decrease in the later years. Starting in 2032, amortized capital costs due to the proposed amendments decrease as a result of fleets having already purchased newer vehicles in prior years to comply with the accelerated turnover mandated by the proposed amendments. Also, as part of the SRIA process, we analyzed the health benefits of the emission reductions. Over the course of fully implementing these potential amendments from 2024 to 2038, there would be 574 fewer premature deaths, 182 fewer hospitalizations, and 278 fewer emergency room visits from asthma. The valuation of all these avoided adverse health outcomes results in $5.76 billion. Again, more details on this and the cost analysis will be included in the publicly available SRIA later this year. Finally, next steps. This is the last planned public workshop related to these amendments, and staff will next develop the regulatory package in the coming months. The final regulatory package will then be released for official public comment 45 days prior to the board hearing. Then we are planning to go before our board with this item by the end of this year. Here we have some Carb contact information, and we'll have the second question and answer period now. So again, there are two ways to participate. Attendees can either raise their hands and staff will call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question verbally. Again, we ask that you leave your hand raised and let Carb staff lower the hand. Or you can type in the question area of the webinar and staff will read out your comment or question. Again, Amber, I'm hoping we can skip over the questions that were related to the first half and see if there's new questions. And then we'll, go to hands. And then if we get through some conversation about the new content, then we'll go back and start answering old questions. Hopefully that's not too difficult.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, they're still coming in. Did you want to go to the raised hands first?
Yeah, let's do raised hands first this time.
All right. James Halloran, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Is he self-muted? We can't hear you if you're speaking. Maybe technical difficulties.
Yeah.
Okay, for right now, we'll just go to the next raised hand. Michael Lewis, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, Mike Lewis, Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition. I guess a couple of questions. One, we owe you some numbers, Nathan, on the cost of the new equipment. I think the numbers you've got are low by today's numbers. And I think you need to use the latest numbers available, or numbers for 2023 certainly, rather than stopping in 2020. So we're gonna provide you with some updated numbers, and I think they're gonna be different. They're gonna be a lot higher in a lot of these categories of equipment. But I guess my question on the regulatory impact assessment numbers, what is it that causes the cost for the last 7 years to be a negative number?
So first to the first question, or not the comment though, is I just wanted to highlight that the numbers, we did incorporate the numbers that you provided several years ago. So the numbers that we have are including those numbers. And the reason it's $2020 is because we started this analysis in 2021. And so we only were able to like bring up the numbers to 2020 years timeframe, if that makes sense, because like we didn't have a full 2021 years information. So that's why it's $20 is what we converted it to. But we did use the numbers that you provided several years ago and then just updated it to make it, inflation and stuff. But so the second question, I was so focused on the first question, I forgot the second question.
I think I can take that one because
Okay.
it has to do with, I don't know if you want to go back to that slide that has the numbers on it.
Oh,
So
that's
those
right,
are
the negatives.
Yeah, so those are the amortized costs over the course of our analysis period, which starts in 2023, because that's the first year. We assumed costs in that year because people would be replacing equipment to comply with the tier 0 phase out on January 1, 2024 through 2038. And so the reason it goes negative in those years is because these are incremental costs. And so in the baseline, and we'll go into a lot more detail in the SORIA, but the baseline for where we start the analysis from includes the current regulation and all the compliance requirements of the current regulation. And then once we get past the requirements of the current regulation, we do assume some regular turnover to keep that fleets will just do business as usual, essentially. And so what they do, and I think they're going to be talking about this in the second part of this when inventory gives an update, that we assume the fleets will maintain some average age moving into the future. And so there is some turnover that's happening in those years under the baseline scenario. What happens when we overlay the proposal is because we're kind of pulling forward some of that turnover that would have happened under the baseline into into earlier years, then that's not happening under the baseline in the later years. And so we get that negative cost there. Does that make any sense?
No.
So it's an
Complex.
incremental, right? So like you would have had a cost under the baseline in, you know, like say 2020, 2034, 2035, 2036, because in those years under the baseline scenario, fleets would be, you know, normally turning over equipment to maintain this average fleet age. But because under the proposal, we actually pulled that turnover ahead into, you know, somewhere between 2023 and, you know, 2030, that cost actually moved forward. And so it's no longer happening in the later years.
I guess I still don't understand how it becomes a negative. I mean, if it's not happening, shouldn't it just be a zero? Why is it a negative?
Because it's an incremental. So like we subtract that out, right? And so like it would have been a cost. You would have had a cost there in those years, but you actually took on that cost in an earlier year. And so in that later year where it would have been there, it's no longer there anymore.
It just doesn't seem like an honest accounting. Did you do the same thing on the health accounting?
The benefits are done completely separate, and they run that through a separate model. But when we do the way the benefits are calculated are based on the same amount of turnover in the same years that we are assessing the costs.
So I think also like maybe it's like if like a specific example, like let's say a fleet has an old piece of equipment that according to the baseline, they would turn over in 2035. So like their baseline scenario, and let's say like that cost $10,000, throwing out numbers. So in 2035, the baseline, they spent $10,000. What we're saying is that we are moving that action up to say 2030 maybe. So the fleet in 2030 buys that piece of equipment for $10,000. So there's a positive number. But then in 2035, now they're doing zero things. So the baseline is 10,000. And now with our amendments, the number is zero. So it is negative $10,000. Is that accurate, Johanna? Maybe that example helps, like visually.
Hi, this is Henry Chang. Mike Lewis mentioned also that there was a question about whether or not the same impact was applied onto the health benefits analysis. I worked in the health benefits analysis, and the answer is so the baseline regulation does assume that the vehicles get cleaner as well, even under the base regulation. And so our baseline health impacts or baseline emissions also get cleaner in the baseline. And so yes, it does also kind of subtract out as your baseline gets lower. So our benefits also get lower in the later years of the amendments. So yes.
Have you got more detailed analysis that you can show us on both of those in terms of how you develop these numbers? Because I'm still skeptical about the negative number.
Yeah, and so the SRIA will be a published document that has the full analysis of everything that went into this that's coming out in the next couple of months. It's still, you know, in review, still getting developed, but that is part of the public process as the SRIA gets released and is much more detailed than this one slide. So definitely let us know once that's released if you have comments or questions at that time. I think we can go to the next hand raised, potentially.
Peter Okarowski, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself.
Hey Nathan,
State
it's
your
Peter
name.
again. Can we go back to your analysis? And I want to make sure I heard you right with Mike Lewis's question. So let's assume I had under the baseline scenario 5 years of $10,000 costs. Okay. Are you suggesting that under the new scenario, you would only have 3 years of $10,000 costs?
No.
No, I thought I didn't hear you correctly. Let's say I have 5 years of $10,000 a year costs in the baseline. What happens in, let's say, 2 years change? Because I think Mike Lewis has got it right. I think if you had a negative number there, then when you added up let's say I was going to have $50,000 in costs. If you've got negative $10,000 for 2 years, that would be a total cost of 10,000, not 30.
So the way we did the analysis is we calculated what the costs are under the baseline scenario for fleets. And so we calculated costs for between 2023 and 2038 for the fleets. And so that's kind of the business as usual case. And that includes compliance with the current regulation. And then based on what that inventory was telling us of what fleets have in their fleet in certain years, then we applied what the proposed requirements of the rule were based on those same numbers, right? So we said, okay, here's how much is getting turned over every year under the baseline, right? This is how much all of that costs. And we used the same numbers for the value on the equipment for that analysis. And then when we overlay the proposal, which is the tier phase out onto that, we then calculated how many vehicles in all of those years would have to be turned over, and then we applied cost numbers to that. So what happens, and then we essentially subtract, in 2023, the baseline was this, the proposal was this, we subtract out, and then that's the cost for that year. This is the same analysis we do for all of our regulations as part of the SRIA process. And so this isn't a new type of analysis. This is the same type of analysis we do for all of the regulations that we do. So we calculate your costs for each year under the baseline. We calculate the costs under this alternate proposal that we have, and then we subtract it out, and that's the numbers that this isn't the exact numbers because these are the amortized costs, but we subtract it out, and that's what you're seeing is the incremental difference between the two.
Do you have a cost in there, just a quick follow-up, for the loss due to stranded asset of that asset?
No, we don't.
So if I assume that it's a 20-year asset and I have to retire it at 10, do you account for in the project costs the loss of that 10 years of that asset?
No, because that would be fleet specific. Every fleet would have a different valuation for that, or a different expectation on that equipment. That isn't something that's standardized.
Interesting. Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Floyd Vergara, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Floyd Vergara, Clean Fuels Alliance America. Apologies if I missed this. Did you say in the SRIA you compared the proposal for R100, or the public health benefits for R100 versus the public health benefits from some of the other scenarios that have been posed in the past, specifically the renewable diesel biodiesel blends that we have suggested in our comments?
So as part of the SRIA, we analyze alternatives, and I don't know how much detail we want to get into right now, but so we do analyze what the renewable diesel is achieving in terms of the health benefits, because those are emission reductions. And then as part of the alternatives we analyzed if we did not have renewable diesel. I don't think that we specifically called out biodiesel as part of one of those alternatives. And I don't know if there's anything else, Johanna, you want to?
No, we didn't do that analysis as part of the SRIA.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious because I think we have pointed out in the past Carb's own study suggesting that the PM reductions from inclusion of biodiesel in that sort of blend would be higher than an R100. And so I'm curious to see what the benefits would look like with a biodiesel blend getting more PM reductions versus the current proposal. But
yeah, and that would be at a loss of NOx benefits. And so as of right now, we're not willing to forego the NOx benefits.
Okay, thanks.
Okay,
I was gonna say one more hand and then we'll go to the Q&A.
All right. Peter Okarowski, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, it's Peter Okarowski again, Transportation Companies and Railroads. I just had a process request, if I could make it. Would it be possible for you guys to send out an email to the listserv when the SRIA gets posted? And then post the SRIA link on your website?
We can look into that, right? See if
Yeah, we can look into that.
good recommendation.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Q&A now. Like I said, Amrit, see if there's new ones about the second half. And then maybe we can loop back to old questions.
Yeah, we just have like two. So we have a question and comment here from David Schmid. The question was, what is the definitive of premature death?
Oh, I'm not actually sure how this is defined. I know like these metrics are what we use in all of our SRIAs and all of our health benefits. So I'm sure very well defined in our SRIA that will be published. I feel like I should know that off the top of my head, how that's defined, but I know it's a metric that we use in all of our rulemakings as part of our SRIAs and our health benefits. I don't know if Johanna, you have a better answer, but maybe not.
I'm looking it up, but we can come back to that.
Okay, he also had a comment. If you showed the baseline cost, the net cost of the regulation would be easier to understand.
And I don't know how it's portrayed in the SRIA, Johanna. Do you know if it has like the baseline every year's costs? And then I don't think it, or maybe.
No.
Okay.
We provide the incremental.
So like what we share in.
All right, we have a question from Lisa Yan. Reading through the language as seen in the new language tier phase out requirements in addition of zero emission equipment. If a contractor applies for funding for a zero emission unit in 2024, does the 2-year tier 1 and tier 2 phase out extension apply if the contractor purchases a replacement equipment via incentives such as the Carb program?
So that is a really good question about the overlay with the Moyer program. I know we've been working very closely with the Moyer program to make sure that we understand what would and would not be eligible for Moyer, and that is specific to those Moyer guidelines. And in one of our previous meetings, we had a table of what would be and would not be eligible in that incentive work group. But I think we need to discuss more about this zero emission flexibility piece of it. I don't know if Johanna, if there's anything additional.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the Carl Moyer program, and that we will be including a section in the initial statement of reasons that will speak to this a little bit more. But my understanding is that even with the voluntary programs, if it is being used for regulatory compliance, and so if you are getting a delay in requirements of the regulation, that vehicle may not be eligible for Carl Moyer funding. But we will have more details on that and what that would look like in the initial statement of reasons.
I'll also add, I know we were talking about Moyer specifically, but there's also the core program, and it would not have those sort of restrictions like that Moyer has. So I think core would be more flexible in terms of you could get core funding potentially. I just want to make sure Moyer wasn't the only incentive program out there for off-road.
Thank you. We have a question from Chris Flake. I thought you said you surveyed the various agencies for their inventory of in-use vehicles, including how long they had been in service. Based on this, it seems that you should be able to ascertain a good estimate on when these must be replaced and what level of stranded assets there would be. You should make this part of your economic evaluation.
I am not aware of that survey.
I think he's referencing our survey, maybe like in October, where we just asked general questions.
Yeah, I don't, if you could give more details on what survey or inventory that you're talking about, that would be helpful to us. But we are, when we do the cost analysis, we are assuming the full cost of that turnover. We did not assume the value of any sale of that equipment in our analysis.
You said the South Coast Air Quality Management Survey?
Okay, that's a different organization and we don't have access to that survey. I don't know if anyone from South Coast we could reach out to them and ask for it, but that wouldn't cover the entire state. That would be limited to that one region, but it's definitely something that we can see if we can get access to.
Thank you, Johanna. We have a comment here from Mark Rose. Please check out the risky business profile for California for the impacts on the economy and more. They can translate them into relevant health metrics.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Nathan, that'll be the end of the questions for the second portion. I can go up and
first
the
let's
other
see
question.
if there's hands raised maybe, and then we can loop back.
There aren't any hands raised at this time.
Okay, I think we can start going through the rest of the written questions then. Sounds good.
Okay. I have a question here from Michael Lewis. Can you provide us numbers on the available renewable and off-road total fuel consumption that you have developed?
So our fuel consumption numbers came from our off-road inventory, which I don't want to speak for inventory because I don't know what's public.
I have those numbers.
Okay.
Let me just go back. Harborcraft is 55 million gallons of diesel, 270 million gallons of diesel for the vehicles subject to this regulation. And according to the LCFS dashboard for 2021, there was, where is that number? Sorry. There was 1 billion gallons of renewable diesel in 2021 available.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. We have a question here from Harmony Gates. Does Carb know that some fleets may need to make permit modifications to their diesel tanks to allow inclusion of renewable diesel? For example, South Coast Air Quality Management District has made facilities modified permits to allow for renewable diesel.
So our understanding is that it's a drop-in fuel. If you can provide like information on what changed with those permits or what exactly South Coast is requiring, our understanding is that it's meets the same standards, ASTM standards as traditional diesel, so it shouldn't have any difference in terms of permitting or performance or so any information on that, let us know. But Because that would be useful to know. And I think I see actually Harmony just raised her hand. Maybe we can, Nimra, can we unmute her now? If that works.
All right.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Harmony Gates with York Engineering. We have some clients that are in South Coast AQMD jurisdiction changing to, or they have diesel tanks that for a different reason, they are needing to include renewable diesel, and the South Coast was making them do permit modifications to allow for it. Now, these modifications are administrative, but it's still the paperwork involved and submissions, probably some kind of administrative fee related to it. So,
you know how long that's taking?
I can check with my team because I'm not on that project. It just
okay.
Had a discussion that I heard them talking about renewable diesel, thought it was for this, found out it's for something else, but that it would impact our off-road fleets. So
no, I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
I can send you guys a separate email so that we can start that conversation.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Amrit, we can go back to written questions.
Sounds good. We've got a question here from Grant Stickney. Does a fleet need to move all Tier 0 equipment into permanent low use in 2024 if they wish to continue to retain them? If so, the horsepower could be used for 2024 backed, but will the horsepower that exceeds the 2024 back be available to be carried over to towards the back in subsequent years to follow?
So to the first question, yes, if you're a large fleet in 2024, you would not be allowed to operate Tier 0 outside of low use. So you'd either have to retire it or put it into the permanent low use designation, before January 1, 2024 to keep using those Tier 0s. To the second question is also, yes, we have proposed, and we heard feedback from this, and as part of why we added it, is that when those changes happen, so like in 2024, you'll be getting rid of all these Tier 0s, and that can be carried over to help meet your 10% backed. So you will get the credit for that, and you will be able to carry that forward past that 2024 date. So basically, yes to both questions. You need to get rid of the Tier 0s, retire or low use, and then you can carry that action forward to help comply with the baseline backed requirements.
Thanks, Nathan. We have a question here from Mark Hoffman. If the prime contractors will be required to report violations of fleet units to Carb, how does one expect to have subcontractors work for them? This is a stiff responsibility to report on your fellow business relationships.
So I think the expectation is that people should be compliant with the regulation. I mean, I think most contracts usually have language that says that you're compliant with state regulations. So I think if it's discovered that a subcontractor is not compliant, that would be an issue. I don't know if I see.
Well, and the proposal includes a provision that requires that prime contractors verify compliance by these fleets before they contract with them. So before they enter a subcontract with that fleet, they should be verifying that the fleet has their certificate of reported compliance as issued by Carb. So ultimately, you would be, reporting to us that if you observe a non-compliant vehicle, you'd be reporting to Carb that you observed that, but also that fleet essentially lied to you and they're in violation of their contract with you because they were supposed to be compliant when you hired them. So that's for you and your businesses to decide whether or not you want to do business with fleets that are not performing, meeting the same laws that other fleets are doing. But we feel pretty strongly that should be a requirement for doing business in California.
The other thing I want to highlight too is one of the benefits of this is we want to make an even playing field to make it so the ones who are complying, who are, having these costs to comply with our regulation, that they're the ones who are chosen, you know, and aren't getting undercut by people who are non-compliant. So having that level playing field amongst the regulated fleets is, we think, a very positive outcome, that, you know, goal that we're trying to achieve. So,
Thank you. We have a question from John Gilliland. For the 200-hour low use exemption, what happens if a photograph is not taken? Does the facility lose the low use exemption?
So Johanna, I know you are more on the implementation side. Maybe you can answer that one.
Yeah, I think if a fleet could provide other evidence of meeting the low use hour limit, we would accept that.
Thank you, Johanna. We have a question here from Bridget McLevy. Can you please clarify the relationship to PERP for those that are following the fleet average option? As it is my understanding, all tiers can still be used after the 2027 deadline as long as it's within the established fleet average standard.
So this regulation is for in-use off-road mobile equipment, not portable equipment. So I am not sure. I don't quite understand what the question is, because we're not proposing changes to the PERP regulation. So I don't know if Bridget, if you would like to be unmuted to be able to maybe provide some clarification. If you would like to, please raise your hand, and we can maybe answer your question a little bit better if we understand what the issue is.
I don't see a raised hand right now, but we can definitely unmute her if she does. We can go on to the next comment though. It's from Bob Shepard. Renewable fuel will have a slight effect on the horsepower, maybe up to 3% decrease, and a slight increase in fuel consumption, also maybe up to 3% for higher horsepower engines. Maybe smaller differences for smaller horsepower equipment. Warranty should not be affected as long as the fuel meets the ASTM D975 fuel spec and the fuel is uncontaminated.
And I think this came up in we had a work group specific to renewable diesel, and I think we hashed out that like the fuel difference was in the extremely high horsepower. Like I think the discussion was around like locomotives at the time. So we did hear that in those very, very large cases, there's that slight difference. But I think that in the majority of the equipment that's covered under this regulation, it was extremely minor. But good comments. Both comments are good. So next question.
All right, we have a couple of comments from Mark Roast. The first one is, could you rerun your replacement timelines with the conversion from fossil fuel to full battery electric power of those vehicles whose bodies are in solid condition? In other words, any vehicle or other equipment which is sound and worth keeping aside from the drivetrain can be converted way earlier than it would normally be replaced.
I'm not sure. So it sounded like the comment was about zero emission and changing equipment to zero emission, or maybe I'm not quite understanding. But we also aren't having any requirements or like full analysis of zero emission technology as part of this. Maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding.
Mark, would you mind? Oh, Mark's hand is raised.
Okay.
Do we want to unmute him?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. What I'm doing here is I'm saying that you've got projections based on replacement time, excuse me, on replacement timelines, excuse me. And it takes 12, 15 or more years to replace a fleet. We don't need to wait for that. We can profitably, for the owners, we can convert the fleet to full battery electric and solar power going into stationary batteries. And all of this can make the, once that's paid off with financing, then all of a sudden you've got 1 million miles left on the vehicle and it's clean. So, so I'm asking, if you could please have somebody consider, run the numbers to, looking at how many vehicles are actually not rusted out, and in each of the fleet sectors, and then look at converting those vehicles and eliminating the need to replace them every so often, and eliminating the need for overhauls and engine replacements every so often, and getting all that savings into their hands. And I would like to see your estimate of how many conversions would be viable across in each sector if the cost was low. And by low, I'm looking at probably in a range of $60 to $100 a kilowatt hour for batteries, and probably well under the current costs for solar, but with the levelized cost of solar being great because we're looking at 20 to 50, 30 to 50 year lifetimes. So in other words, the alternative of converting the fleet instead of waiting it for the whole fleet to age out, and getting the value in time to meet the governor's objectives and to meet even the science need. That's what I'm pushing for, and I'd like to have your support in terms of getting the research done so that we can actually use that research to attract investment funding and subsidies. That clear, or did I just confuse it?
No, I think we get where you're going. So a couple things. One, I think this is a really great conversation for the zero emission transitional concept that we have that is voluntary, but it sounds very connected to what we're trying to do there with this voluntary flexibility for fleets to fully transition, fleet-wide transition to zero emission technology, and having a pathway in our regulation for that. Great. But I also want to highlight just that because this is a regulation where we're targeting these near-term NOx and PM, we weren't proposing having a hard requirement that anybody go zero emission, in the very near term. We are trying to get to this governor's N7920, and that's why we have these couple concepts for flexibility to allow for zero emission technology, because we want that same thing. So I think the conversation about it is very pertinent to those voluntary zero emission pathways. But I just wanted to also highlight that, the hard requirements that we're proposing are, near-term NOx and PM, readily available technology. We want to make sure the technology is available for what we're requiring. So there's kind of like two facets of kind of what we're doing here, if that makes sense. And I don't know, Johanna, if there's anything you want to add to.
I like your idea of the voluntary thing, and what I'm really looking, we're expecting to be disruptive technology. We're expecting to have opportunities to show the trucking industry how great it is and get them to switch voluntarily. And so I would definitely like to talk to you more about that voluntary program. And I will put my email address in the chat here.
Perfect. That sounds really good. And I think I see one more question, and I think we can take it, and then we have one more presentation to do. So I think we'll try and wrap up pretty quickly and allow for the next part.
All right, Michael Lewis, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, Mike Lewis with the Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition. I wanted to go back to a comment Johanna made, because I want to understand on the turnover provisions, I guess the ban and the turnover. I'm a little confused, because I thought you said that if your fleet was in compliance when the credits ran out, you still had the 10% option.
No. So the credits expire for large and medium fleets, they expire on January 1, 2023. If you meet the fleet average target at that point, under the current regulation, you don't have to do anything further except to continue to meet that fleet average target moving forward. If you do not meet the fleet average target, then you are on that 10% turnover path.
So does the 10% turnover then, is that superseded by the ban? Or could you stay on the 10% turnover and the?
No, so you would still need to comply with the phase out. So you would still need to phase out your tier zeros for a large fleet by January 1, 2024. Now that could also help you comply with your 10% turnover. So if you had, let's say 15% tier zeros, then you could use the turnover, the tier phase out, the tier zero phase out, the 10% to also comply with your 10% turnover required under the back provisions of the current rule. And then the extra 5% would roll over until the next year, and you could use that for your next 10%.
So as long as you're on the 10%, then the ban doesn't apply to your fleet, or?
No, it does apply to your fleet, but you can use the turnover you're doing for the ban to comply with the phase out. I'm sorry, you're getting me confused, Mike. You can use the phase out requirements to comply with your 10% turnover.
Okay. All right.
So
well,
we are adding in language that would allow you to roll over credits in the 10% world if you have to turn over more than 10% under the phase out provisions.
Okay, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, I know that was a negotiated resolution back when, 10 plus years ago, and I want to make sure we are staying with what that understanding was and not upsetting it, because an awful lot of fleets had made their plans based on that assumption. So I guess I need to go back and take a look at what that resolution was with the AGC negotiation back then. So I appreciate the explanation of how that works. Thanks.
Yeah.
One thing I want to do, so I want to wrap up soon. I see a couple questions, but I forgot that Jim Halloran was trying to speak earlier, and I don't know if we want to try, Jim, if you want to say something, can you try and raise your hand and we can try and unmute you? I remember we had those technical difficulties and I don't want to ignore anybody. So maybe if you want to speak, raise your hand, or if you're good. In the meantime, maybe we can take one written question though, while maybe if Jim, you want to speak.
Yeah, we have a question here from Lisa Grody. There's two questions. The first is, how did we come up with the $5.76 billion saved for breathing issues? How many of those cases were due to the wildfires, which we know to be the worst contributor to PM issues? And secondly, how do you intend to monitor fleets in remote areas for compliance?
So to the first question, we don't analyze wildfire impacts as any part of our SRIA process or our regulatory process. What those numbers were is that we have certain emission reductions we are achieving by these amendments, and that was shown in one of the earlier slides. And those emission reductions have an impact on health benefits. So we took the emission reductions, and then that translated through a calculation that will be, as part of the publicly available SRIA, has certain health benefits such as fewer premature deaths, et cetera, et cetera. So those numbers, that valuation, and the health benefits, actually, I'll go back to that slide. So these health benefits is directly caused by the reduction of emissions of our amendments. And then that valuation, that last one, is each of these metrics has a certain sort of dollar assigned to it, that it kind of all gets added together to be a valuation. So the valuation is the 574 fewer premature deaths has some sort of valuation to it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how this is analyzed. And then the second one, remote enforcement, is currently the base regulation, we enforce it throughout California. So current enforcement policy is how it would be addressed in the future. Right now we enforce the regulation, so it would continue in that way. So I don't think Jim raised his hand, so maybe hopefully everything's good there. I think there's one more, if there's one more question, I think we can take it. I want to make sure we give time to the last part of the presentation though. So one more question.
That wraps it up, Nathan.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so we can move on to the last part. I'll have to stop sharing. Okay, so Russell and Corey, take it away.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Russell Fury. I'm a staff member of the off-road diesel analysis section, and I will be presenting a presentation on the current in-use inventory. So just give me one moment to pull that up, and we can begin shortly. Okay, can someone just let me know if they can see the presentation?
Looks good, Russell.
Perfect. All right, great. So today I'll be talking about the current version of the construction, or the updates, I should say, to the construction, mining, industrial, and oil drilling emission inventories. So a brief overview of the equipment covered in this inventory. This is primarily equipment in the construction, mining, industrial, and oil drilling industries. This equipment is over 25 horsepower, diesel powered, and self-propelled. The basis of their applications is varied. Applies broadly to any, so the regulation and what this inventory applies to is any self-propelled off-road equipment that are not, it's not agricultural or forestry or cargo handling equipment. So far they've been, this equipment has been required to report to Carb since 2007, and because of its subject, of it being subject to the in-use off-road regulation. Okay, excuse me. So the emission inventory and the updates. The emission inventory accounts for harmful emissions from the equipment I just outlined. This equation here is the basic, the basis of the inventory itself, and that is that the emissions. This calculation is the emissions equals the population times the horsepower of the equipment, the activity of the equipment, the load factors of the load of the engines in that equipment, and just the emission factors, so the factors to create the pollutants, or for emission factors being the emissions per brake horsepower hour of the equipment. Next up is the sources and the updates to these sources for the inventory. So the main sources and their updates to the inventory is that the population and the horsepower information comes from the doors reporting system from the 2020 or 2020 calendar year. The activity of the equipment, it comes from a 2020 doors voluntary survey. The load information, this one is not updated. This was from the previous inventory, that is the 2011 inventory. And the activity and load factor readjustment is information is coming from a 2021 Energy Information Administration report, as well as a California Board of Equalization report. And finally, the emission factors were updated in 2017 through an update that our section has made. So to go into more detail about these inputs, first off is the population from doors. So this inventory used information from, as I said, from the 2020 calendar year. What the information we get from the doors database is mainly down to the equipment type of the horsepower of the equipment. If this equipment has any special designations, that is, say, low use, emergency, snow removal equipment, etc., and down to their what fleet size that they are part of. So if it's a small, medium, or large fleet, and those designations are outlined in the current regulation. So a bit about the equipment that we got from doors. Excuse me. This is information about the equipment by the fleet sizes. As you can see here, it's the amount of equipment that's assigned to each fleet size category. The largest, portion is owned by large fleets, and the about a third is owned by small fleets, and then the rest of the portion is owned by medium fleets. So medium fleets being the smallest grouping by equipment here. So another breakdown of the doors population for you is by horsepower bin. So these horsepower bins are outlined in the current regulation. This is just to for fleet analysis. The back credits and other calculations that need to be done, they are assigned using different factors for those calculations. So as you can see here, most of the equipment, at least proportion in their fleet size, is relatively is relatively evenly distributed from 25 horsepower up to 175. Equipment that's larger, that has a larger horsepower than 175, is mainly owned by large fleets. And as you can see, the 600 horsepower and above is a relatively a smaller portion of the entire fleet. So moving on to the activity information, there was a voluntary survey within doors that we conducted in mid-2020. The response that we got included about covered about 5,000 vehicles. We took that information and sorted it by age, equipment type, equipment size, and fleet size. And what you can see here is a bit of the information that we got. This is a chart showing the horsepowers per year that a piece of equipment would use, sorted by their fleet size and horsepower bin. If you see that activity information by age, you can see here as the equipment is older, the less it's being used, or as this graph kind of shows it, how if it's newer, it's used more. This information is incorporated in activity profiles but that which also includes the fleet size, the equipment type, and horsepower bin. This is just to show you the overall trend in the statewide fleet. To move on to the load factors in the inventory. Currently, the emissions rates are still using the information from the 2011 model. Or previous, I should say, the 2011 inventory. The equipment types used in this current inventory have expanded though. So their assumptions were made to apply previous values to new equipment types. Currently right now, Carb is performing a new study on load factors, which take into account duty cycle data. We plan to take the results of this study and hopefully other studies to apply it to future inventories. And I think there might be a bit about that. There's a bit later on about that. So for fuel balancing, there's a fuel balancing analysis done. So we took the results of the inventory and the fuel used in the inventory and compared it to the two studies, to the Energy Information Administration's report, which provides off-road fuel sold, and the California Board of Equalization report, which provides on-road fuel that was sold, but then was given tax credits or tax credits sought for off-road use. So on-road fuel, but was used off-road. So this graph here shows the balancing that was done. This is the after the balance was performed. The left being the two reports divided up by the off-road, industrial, commercial, and those Board of Equalization refunds. And on the right, the Carb emission inventory fuel use. So that would be, as you can see, in red, the current inventory we're talking about, the in-use inventory, the commercial hovercraft, portable equipment, truck refrigeration units, logging, and other sources. For growth rates of the growth of the inventory, what we have is we have used the overall fuel growth or overall fuel used as the metric for growth. In this graph right here, this is from the historic U.S. Energy Information Administration of the fuel sold. It's slightly decreases over time, but levels out between 2014 to 2019 because of this metric. We are assuming a no growth scenario for this inventory. Now to move on to tier information. So there's the background on off-road emission standards. So the emission standards for construction, mining, and drilling, and drilling are split into tiers, which have increasingly stringent requirements on NOx emission rates. So currently we have 6 different tiers from tier 0 to tier 4 final. On a brake horsepower hour basis, the final tier 4 requirement is about 1/80th the emission factor of tier 0, just to give a overall example there. So how this is reflected in the inventory itself. So those were the standards, but in 2017, off-road analysis section, we created a updated emission factors. As you can see here in this graph, the new emission factors are close to the previous values, but are now reflecting testing and use of credits by engine manufacturers in their compliance. So to discuss how forecasting was done in the inventory, there are, we're going to divide it up a little bit. There's two portions to forecasting turnover. There's natural turnover, which would be what was undertaken without any outside pressures or just naturally in a fleet. And then there's also a regulation turnover, regulation check turnover. This is additional turnover being applied to the inventory. So inventory calculates natural turnover first and then performs a check for the current regulation and applies more turnover if needed. How this is done is that the forecasting requires modeling the age distribution of equipment into future years. So therefore a turnover curve is needed, which is an average rate of vehicle turnover over time. 3 turnover curves were created based on the fleet size of the equipment, or with the fleet size that the equipment is in. These curves are based off the equipment distribution found indoors. So what this graph here is showing is the year-over-year change in equipment normalized to 1. So say that as age 0 equipment ages, this would be the percent of equipment remaining in use as it's grown older. So for the current regulation, in practice, there are 2 pathways. There's the ability for a fleet to meet their fleet average target. And there's also the back rate of 10% of turnover of fleet horsepower, or I should say not turnover, excuse me, of fleet horsepower, which can be a combination of turnover, VDEX, and credits. So for the purposes of the inventory, the inventory calculates a fleet average target and fleet average index for the overall statewide fleet sizes, so the small, medium, and large fleets. If a fleet average is met after natural turnover, there's no additional turnover applied. But if a fleet average is not met, additional turnover is applied, and but that's also limited by the VSE and credits. So it's not going to be, whenever it will be 10%, but it's going to be a portion of that. The So total turnover is limited to maintain an average age for each size group. So we allow for we calculate for average age and do a check on that average age of the fleet's sizes, and we allow that to vary depending on the size of the regulation. So let's assume that regulation, if a fleet is under regulation, is accelerating turnover of that fleet. So this therefore makes the fleet younger. So following the regulation, or when it's in compliance, fleet turnover slows, and therefore the average age will increase to match pre-regulatory fleet average ages. In practice, in this purpose, the small fleets, the average age is reduced over the course of the regulation, and then increases after. And then for medium and large fleets, the average age stay constant until the fleet average targets are met, and then increase to pre-regulation levels. And I'll show you what these the results of this look like in the next slide. So how it looks in practice. So you can see here these are the average ages of the fleets. So as I said before, as a small fleet undergoes the regulation and works towards compliance, it is reduced. Its average age is reduced up until 2029, and then from there is allowed to age up again to about 13, average age of 13 years. Large fleets start out at shy under 8 years of age, steady in that at that average age up until 2029, and then is allowed to age up. Around 2043 is when it hits pre-regulation average age, and then is held there. So you can see for medium fleets it's held about steady up until 2032, and then is allowed to it allows its average age to increase up to about 14.5, which is where it was pre-regulation. And then there's a slight decrease, but that's just due to variances in turnover. So there is a bit of variability in each year, just because of this is a check and not like forcing it to be the exact age that we want it to be. And so what that results in is, I'll show you here in a moment, the emission results. Here is the NOx emissions in tons per day, year over year. As you can see, this is separated by the tier standards. The largest proportion in 2020 is from tier 0 engines, but over time, the fleet gets cleaner, and the amount of emissions reduces down. How this compares to the previous inventory in 2011 is shown here. As you can see, the previous inventory and the current inventory pretty much align up until 2023 or 2024. And then there's a bit of deviation. The new inventory is shown to have a lower emissions than the previous 2011 inventory did. And by fleet size. So here's the difference in the emissions by the different fleet sizes. So, and this is pretty much representative of the overall population distribution. Large being the largest contributor, and smallest being the second largest. So for future updates, this is, I should say not for this current inventory, but for updates for in the future for the next iteration. We have research being currently done that could show emission factors by load bin. So there's a potential issue with low load and low temperature operation of equipment, and that low load and low operation could see increased NOx rates. So the research includes emissions testing determined by the load bin and the temperature of the engine, and the activity loggers, and uses activity data loggers. So it determines the average time at different load bins. This can impact many of our off-road categories, and the expected completion of the study is in late 2022 and early 2023, or early 2023, excuse me. So I'm going to open the presentation to questions and comments. Please use the Q&A section to ask any questions or to raise your hand in the Zoom software. We can unmute you and you can ask your question. The presentation is to be published online soon, but however, if for an immediate copy, please send an email to me requesting it. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions and comments. Let's see.
Hi, Russell. I'll read off some of the comments that we have so far.
Perfect.
And we can go down. So the first one, just regarding the emission inventory load, why did we use the 2011 loads and not a more recent year for the engine load?
Okay. Well, the load is provided by, was actually provided in 2011 as a, done by a survey. So we would have to initiate another, to update it, we have to initiate another survey, basically, to update it. And we feel like that with the amount of time and effort that would take, there wouldn't be too much variation from the 2011 inventory.
All right. And the next one is, this is Greg Stevenson. Is there any correction to reflect the reality that most or less than half of ORD equipment is registered indoors based on the Fullerton survey? And I can take this one, I think. So that's the LSI equipment. Greg, and I'll send you the link to our presentation on that. There was a correction to that equipment, but this is only the diesel equipment indoors. So it's not the same group of equipment. But if you'd like to follow up with questions about the Fullerton survey, just if you shoot Russell a note, he can forward it on. Okay, the next one is Paul Hensley. Has ARB done any recent QA/QC on the equipment registered indoors to kick out equipment that was not vehicles, such as generators or compressors, which should have been subject to the portable engine ATCM rather than doors? In 2016, based on model numbers and equipment names, I identified between 500 to 1,000 pieces of equipment that were portable and shouldn't have been indoors. And to implement their revised standards, it seems like equipment should be properly classified. And I think Johanna is going to jump in.
Yeah, I can answer this one. So Paul, we do periodic QA/QC on the equipment registered indoors, and we do review the data that we have, and we reach out to fleets to make sure that the equipment is reported accurately. Do we get 100% of the equipment? I don't know. But I can tell you that we do these QA/QCs periodically throughout the year, and we get through multiple a year. So.
All right, I'll go on to the next question. What has been the calculated drop in emissions since the start of the program in 2007?
to be over, I'm guessing that means over the non-regulation, correct? It was, I assume.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. I think that, if I remember correctly, we have just been performing emissions calculations on what would be, it was basically business as usual, which would be with the regulation in place, and not comparing it to without it being in place, because it's already currently underway. For analysis of the reductions, I would refer back to the calculations done for the previous inventory, actually, or the reporting for the previous inventory, and when the regulation was created.
And I think if he emails you too, we can send him a link on that as
Yes.
well, just to the previous write-up. Okay. The next one is David Schmidt. Is the emissions inventory compared to any actual tailpipe emissions?
Sure,
I can take this one. So Russell covered the emission factors, specifically the emission factors by tier, and those are taken off of testing that's done right off of engines. So the emission inventory calculates population, then activity, and then compares like per hour. It does compare, it does use actual tailpipe emission data and that information. To get the statewide one, you'd need then sensors on everything in the state. So that's why we can do testing on tailpipes for a number of vehicles, and then we apply that to the statewide population activity. So we do testing on tailpipe emissions, but there's not sensors out there for all the equipment. Okay, the next one, David Schmidt. Does the emission inventory take into account doors registered equipment that operates out of state?
It does not. If it were to operate out of state, then it wouldn't be, I guess if it's,
I think they're thinking of ones that operate some portion of the time out of state.
I see.
I can take, it's just the fuel balancing we do takes into account the California fuel that's dispensed. So unless there's large scale operations that are buying tons of fuel in California and then operating that in equipment out of state, which I don't think we're aware of, then we would be accounting for their in-state operations across the off-road inventories.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd be in the population though. And if they're primarily used out of state, then as long as they're not exporting a significant chunk of fuel out of state, then that'll show up in the activity. Okay, next one from Mike Lewis. Your emissions chart seems to show emissions from tier 0, 1, and 2 past the dates in which they are banned. How is that?
Oh, so this is the current emission inventory. This would be it's only showing the emissions for the current regulation, and this is not forecasting any of the proposed amendment or proposed regulations. So the backstop, there's no backstop or removing of the tier engines in this version I'm showing you right here. So those calculations have been done by the reg team, and then so those are modifications off of this.
All right. Next from Lorenzo Pacini. Tier 4 engines use more fuel to create the same amount of energy, and what is Carb's take on this? And the low use exemption is used by many farmers in California that is very critical. Will there be another open filings for farmers to register and become exempt?
What was the first part of the question again?
Sorry, it's Tier 4 engines use more fuel to create the same amount of energy. And how does Carb see this?
I see. I'm not sure if I can answer that. Do you think Corey or Johanna, you could take this one?
Yeah, I think it's a good question.
Yeah.
I think we have seen some actual fuel benefits from Tier 4 in the off-road side. There's a recent study that was created when manufacturers certify their engine. We were seeing that the efficiency gained through the Tier 4s was actually offsetting, more than offsetting the, obviously some fuel can be needed to run the DPF and or SCR systems. So we can share that with you if you'd care to email Russell. I think we could forward you a draft copy of that. We're seeing a very minor fuel benefit over actual operations. So we definitely agree that some fuel is spent on the emissions controls. However, we're seeing that offset with just improvements in efficiency when we compared, I think, several thousand pieces of off-road equipment.
And then I think I can take the second half of the question. So for this rule, vehicles used 100% of the time in agricultural operations are exempt from the regulation. And vehicles used 50 to 99% of the time in agricultural operations have to report and label their equipment. And that includes reporting hours to us. We aren't proposing any changes to those, the applicability for ag equipment, so there would be no changes to those provisions.
And the next question, Miguel Lopez, on slide 25 for future updates and emission factors on low load. The question is, due to low load operations and potential increase in NOx, how will this impact all off-road categories? And I can take this one. It really just depends on what we're seeing in the study. On-road side, we did see that overall there was an increase in emissions when accounting for low loads and particularly low temperatures. I don't know where we'll end up on off-road. We may see increases due to that. However, this also will update load factors specifically. So if off-road equipment spend less time in low load conditions and they spend more time in higher load conditions or higher temperatures, we might not see the same increase. So we wanted to be clear that the work is ongoing, but until it's completed, I don't think we'll have an honest answer to that question. And we do have one follow-up from Greg Stevenson, just checking into the diesel in the Fullerton survey. So I think the Fullerton survey was looking just at forklifts. And so it definitely wasn't trying to survey most of the equipment that makes up this inventory and is indoors. And Greg, if you'd like to follow up just in a higher level of detail, feel free to just reach out to Russell with the email at the end of the presentation. And we can include you in those conversations for sure. All right, and we do have one hand up. We're out of the question and answers, but we do have one hand up. And I might have to ask. Okay.
Lorenzo Pacini, you have been unmuted. Please unmute yourself. State your name and affiliation, ask your question.
Hi, my name is Lorenzo Pacini, and I'm calling because you said that there is an ag exemption for vehicles used 100% of the time in agricultural capacity. Is that correct? Hello?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. So yeah, Lorenzo, there's an exemption for agricultural equipment in the existing regulation, and we're not proposing any changes to that.
So right now, farmers cannot register their, if they missed the window in 2012, they cannot register their trucks now as ag exempt. Also,
No, I think you're talking about the truck and bus regulation. We're talking about the off-road diesel regulation. So we're talking about different equipment.
So even if you have a tier 0 generator that's used 100% in ag, you're saying you can get an exemption for that, but all the counties are requiring you to have tier 4 final or switch to propane.
Yeah, this regulation does not cover generators. That's either stationary or portable equipment.
Even if they're used in agricultural capacity.
This regulation does not cover generators. That's covered under stationary and portable equipment. You would need to look to those regulations to see how they deal with agricultural operations under those rules.
Okay, so this only covers what kind of equipment?
So this would be off-road diesel equipment, 25 horsepower or greater, that's self-propelled.
Okay.
So if you have more questions about whether or not your equipment is subject to this regulation, please reach out to us and we can get that all figured out for you.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
All right, and for now, we can give everybody a few more moments. For now, there's no more questions or hands raised. See if anybody has last-minute entries. And then I wanted to check with Nathan and Johanna, if you have anything to add.
I would just say if anyone has comments or questions for us too, we still have a few more minutes, so feel free if there's any last minute lingering questions about what I presented as well. But I think we're pretty good to wrap up also, whenever.
Oh, I guess maybe, Corey, we should mention that the slides for the inventory, at least, will be posted in the next 3 days, right? At the MSEI meetings workshops page.
Yes, and it will include this video as well, a recording of the presentations, both Nathan's and Russell's, I believe, together.
Perfect.
Also just highlight again the next steps for the amendment process. Like I mentioned, this is the last public workshop we're planning to have, and then we'll be developing the final regulatory package, which includes the initial statement of reasons and the final reg language. And that package will be released in several months, 45 days prior to the board hearing. And there's an official public comment period. And then the board hearing will be by the end of this year. So expect all of the regulatory package to come out in several months from now.
And we'll send a notification out to the listserv once that package is posted. So I guess I'd just like to add, if if you didn't feel comfortable bringing your comments to us today in the public forum, please feel free to reach out to us. Russell's contact information is up here. The contact information for Nathan and I are on the slides that we presented. And so, just reach out to us and we'd be willing to talk one-on-one with you.
I see a question came up. I'll just read it. Alexander Ambrose asked, in general concept vehicle adding ban, what does non-California certified relate to? So part of the amendment concept that we have right now is starting in 2028. A fleet would only be allowed to add engines that are California certified. And as of right now, that's Tier 4 final is the same federally in California certified. So Tier 4 final equipment, is covered under that part of the regulation. But the purpose of that is to make sure that anything that is being added to fleets starting in 2024 has been certified by California. Hopefully that answers.
2028.
Oh, is what?
Yeah, you said 2024.
Oh, sorry, 2028, yes. Okay, I don't see anything else, and I think we've paused long enough where we can justify wrapping things up. Again, as Johanna mentioned, contact information for Russell was shared, and then for Johanna and I, we had it in our presentation as well, so feel free to reach out if you want to make any comments one-on-one or set up any meetings. And I kind of already went over the next steps, so if there's no more questions or comments, I think we are good to wrap up. And I hope everybody has an excellent evening.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Mm.